I was born and raised in a cult. When I escaped, I learned that their beliefs were real. The decision to leave wasn't an easy one, although it had been brewing for almost 2 years. I'm not going to repeat the cult's name. They're known to track down their dissidents and use methods, lawful or not, to take you back, but safe to say it was a big production cult, and as I've learned, quite a classic one at that. We lived in a compound in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a thick forest, and our numbers were among the hundreds. I was born and raised there, a bastard child bred through the orders of the elders by 2 people who could barely stand each other. And I wasn't the only one. Years before, the elders had made up couples of most of the compound's residents during the exact same time, and now there were at least 100 kids the exact same age, and a bunch of grumpy parents raising them. Some families worked well together. Mine didn't. But of course, my parents loved each other, as did everyone love everyone else. It wasn't love, but a societal agreement, which shamed those who fought back, those who showed any feelings besides complacency. They called it true love, and it permeated everything and everyone. I was around 13 when the first cracks started to appear. One late night my dad had smuggled booze into our house and gotten himself drunk, a serious offense, were he to be caught. I guess he didn't care, and as he drank more and more his inhibitions melted away, and the white-hot anger that had festered inside him for years and years finally gasped for air. He began to yell at my mom, calling her all sorts of names. Said that she's the reason his life was so dry. That he had never truly loved her, and through the years, she'd only become smaller and uglier in his eyes. That I was a mistake. She didn't fight back, and that doubled his anger. And then he began to hit her. I didn't see Dad for a while after that, but the damage was done, both for me and my mom. Even after they let her out of the infirmary 2 weeks later, her face was dark and puffy, a handful of bloody band-aids covering the cuts on her skin. As for me, I'd seen that true love was not real. It was not permanent. Although it might have had good intentions, it was merely planted. An image of the truth, plastered on the walls, a false god. Now, you need to remember that I was brought up there. It's all I ever knew. To me, that world was the truth. But even so, doubt chewed at the skin of my fingers, and the distinct feeling of something not being right began to take hold of me. This brought up great deals of shame and fear, but sweeping it all under the rug only made it feel worse. From then onwards, I began to see the bickering and infighting that I used to look past and think of as a sign of normality. And how come if things were so good, our house couldn't stay warm through the night? And why did we eat the same thing every day? And why did the elders decide everything, even though their decisions made others miserable? The idea that this was all somehow not real crept in, and the more I thought of it, the stronger that feeling became. I hid it well. My parents barely cared for me. Neither of them wanted to have me, and raising me was done with minimum requirements in mind. I was just a byproduct of true love, commanded by the elders. So, as long as I fulfilled my duties around the compound, they didn't really care what I was doing, or how I was feeling, or what I was thinking. The rest of them were too occupied with work or their own problems to check on me. The thought of leaving entered my mind erratically one day, and it scared me. It was one of the worst things to think. That's how we'd been brought up, like this was heaven and the rest of the world was hell, and you'd be eternally doomed, and extremely stupid, to leave. But there it was, dangerous and sweet, and it wouldn't let go. As I let the thought brew, I started becoming more comfortable with it. Even though it was horrible at first, soon it became familiar, and its potency lessened each day. The thought's sequel followed shortly thereafter: I will leave. Once I'd made the decision, it was mostly a matter of pragmatics. Although I didn't know what would be waiting for me in the outside world, I did know how the compound worked, and that's where I decided to base my plan on. In a few months' time there would be a great ritual, something of a legend that everyone had always talked about, but seemed like a fable more than anything. But it was coming either way, and seeing as everyone would attend, it was my best shot at leaving unnoticed, giving me a head start at least, while everyone was occupied. Along the weeks following up to the ritual, we had multiple briefings for the kids about the ritual, through which I gathered enough intel to know the exact spot where I would have the least chance of being caught when crossing the fence surrounding the compound. They didn't tell us what the ritual would be, only that we would get a fancy meal during it, and we basically just needed to show up on time. The hardest part was keeping myself preoccupied and inconspicuous. Every time I opened my mouth, I was scared that I would scream I'm going to escape on the day of the great ritual. But luckily, no such thing happened. Everyone was so preoccupied with getting the compound in tip-top shape for the ritual, I doubt anyone noticed me acting any different. The night before the ritual, I packed a small leather bag with some clothes, a bottle of water, and a can of antiperspirant, and hid it under my bed. Everything was quite scarce at the compound, so it's all I could sneak away without anyone noticing. I barely slept, the go bag burning a hole in the bed frame, the excitement keeping a steady pulse of erratic thoughts pumping into my mind, keeping it busy, readying it for any and all situations. The ritual was scheduled to begin after dusk, so I went about my day as normal. If I hadn't been so tired, I'm sure someone would have found me out. I was that excited. And scared. Scared more than I'd ever been before. Dusk began to settle and everyone gathered around the center of the compound. We were all grouped up in our own families with 10 feet of distance to each other, forming a long and wide semicircle around a makeshift stage, kind of like we were queuing towards it. I stood there with my parents, who looked more serious than I think I'd ever seen them, and we watched the stage in silence. It must have taken 15 minutes for the elders to slog up the stage. One of them, their sort of leader, tapped the microphone, and gigantic speakers screeched in a monstrous feedback loop. Someone turned the gain down and the elder continued, his colleagues spread on the stage behind him in a semicircle of their own. The speech was boring, much like most speeches given by the elders. Especially with my newfound ideology, their mumbo-jumbo about true love and our strength and the one true God sounded more derivative than ever before. I quickly tuned it out and began to scout my surroundings, adrenaline beginning to seep into my veins. I was finally going to leave. Our family was situated at the outermost line of people, so all I had to do was wait for an opening and sneak away. Some kids were already migrating around, the elder's speech not interesting enough to hold their attention. It was weird, all the adults staring and listening so intently, and us kids being let to do as we pleased, which was something we could barely ever do. Something was different, but it coincided with my plan, so I didn't really care. I looked around, and waited for my chance, but then the elders said something and my dad turned around to face me, giving me a slight scare. "Say goodbye to your mother," he told me, his face twitching as if he was working more than usual to keep his signature straight face. Goodbye Mom," I said, turning to her, knowing that my dad's orders were always my dad's orders. It was best not to fight him. He had thrown me for a loop, this was unexpected, and I couldn't really hold my focus on both the ritual and the escape at the same time. All the other kids were saying goodbye to their moms as well, some hugging them, even. None of us seemed to have any idea what was happening, but the parents must have known something, because I could hear some of the older guys crying. It wasn't part of true love to cry, and this threw me off further. A deep unsettling feeling made its home in my stomach, pulling me down in a dark vortex. Crap, had I missed my chance? I thought, hoping so very hard that I hadn't. Now, open their hearts. Open their true love for our children, my brothers. Look into your mothers, children. They bless you with true love. The elder screamed into the microphone. All of the women in the compound kneeled and bowed their heads. I started to hear screaming from afar. My dad interrupted me by grabbing my head and turning it to face him. A few feet away, my mother was kneeling like all the others. "You must watch this," he said, "and don't let your eyes wander." Staring at me to make sure that I was watching, he approached my mom and grabbed her hair, wrapping her long ponytail around his fist. "For the one true God," he said, and began to pull. She screamed from the pain, and he locked his heels into the dry ground, his boots spitting dust into the air, pulling with all his weight. At first, nothing seemed to happen, but suddenly a red crack formed at the base of her skull. Quickly, it began to widen, ripping and tearing the skin in two. Now the screams were everywhere, deafening and hellish. Once the initial crack had been achieved, my dad didn't need to pull as hard anymore. He took a quick breath, and relaxed his arms for a moment, then returned to the pulling with newfound vigor. Her scalp began to peel off like the skin of an avocado. Bright red blood and flesh pulped from disturbed blood veins, the stream slowly revealing her skull, white hot, like his anger had been when he'd almost beat her to death. Dad grunted as he worked, and once the top of Mom's skull was completely bare, he tugged one last time, ripping the skin completely off her head. The edges of her skin drooped over her ears and face. I looked around, and saw the exact same process being done to all of the other women. Some were already finished, some still in between, the men grunting and flailing and kicking the ground to force the skin off the skull, the women screaming in agony. And as children, we couldn't help but watch. Frozen in place. Too scared to do anything. I started to hear a blunt tapping sound, followed by an egg-like cracking. I looked back at my parents. I barely recognized them. Mom was covered in blood, sobbing quietly. Dad stood over her with a hammer in his hand, tapping it on her exposed skull. He had to hold her head with one hand to keep it steady. After each careful swing, he'd use his fingers to pry her head, picking up small pieces of skull bone and throwing them on the ground beside me. He was sweating profusely, his eyes wide and fixated, determined to finish the job. After a large chunk of bone hit the ground, he took a step back and contemplated his work, like a sculptor zooming out and taking in the whole. Seemingly satisfied, he called my name and ordered me beside him. Although being near him was the absolute last thing I wanted to do, I knew that not obeying his orders would ruin any sliver of escape I might still have. I powered through, like I always had, and walked up to him. He handed me a silver spoon, engraved with odd, janky symbols. I had never seen such a fancy spoon before, usually we just ate with stainless steel sporks that had been in use for all my life. I stared at its eloquent contours and its strange symbols, but then he interrupted me by grabbing my wrist and saying, "Eat." "What?" I asked him. "I have given you so much, and your mother is giving you the last of her. Now eat," he replied. It was an order, and orders were followed. Although I was still unsure what I was supposed to do, I lifted the spoon up and looked at him inquisitively, hoping that he wouldn't be angry. He groaned and took me by the shoulders, leading me to stand above Mom. "Eat," he yelled, frustration flaking off his voice. I looked down and saw the hole he had dug. Coarse, sharp edges of skull formed a pot, with wormy strands of brain inside, faintly pulsating, streaks of blood pouring in different directions. "Mom?" I asked, leaning my head to have a look at her face. "She's gone already." Now eat, before it's too late, Dad said, lifting my head back up. I stabbed the spoon gently between a crack in the brain's surface, and tried to scoop out as small of a piece as I could. Mom began to scream again, but she stood still, managing her agony. My dad hadn't yelled at me yet, so I knew I was doing what he wanted me to do. It took considerable force, but I managed to free a slug-sized bite of Mom's brain. As I looked at the piece, faintly jiggling in the middle of the spoon, I wondered which memories and ideas it held. Which part of Mom was I about to eat? Eat it. Right now. Dad screamed, seriously angry by then. I put the spoon into my mouth and tried to immediately swallow, but the piece got stuck in my throat. A gag followed by a small puddle of vomit dislodged it, though, but that meant that I had to swallow my own vomit alongside the brain piece. A quick glance at the fury in my dad's eyes forced me to do it. I knew that he was reaching that same point he had that night with my mom. I wondered if his anger was as potent when he was sober, if he hit with more or less precision. Good. Continue, he said approvingly as I gulped down the contents of my mouth. I chipped off more pieces, initially trying to salvage something of her, which quickly proved futile. She no longer screamed, and with each bite, she became more limp, her body swaying lazily as I gobbled down all that she was and ever had been in tough, wet bites, that made my jaws sore from the chewing. Mucus and blood trailed down my chin, and I noticed that Mom had begun to drool. She was still alive, but whatever she had been was forever gone. Looking down became unbearable, so as I chewed each bite, I glanced at the others. Most of the screaming had stopped, and the noise reminded me of the chow hall during lunch hour, although without the droning chatter of conversation. All of the other kids were eating as well. Some of the women had already fallen down on the ground, limp and unmoving, but we kept eating, each father making sure that their kids sank their spoon into the mind of their mother. I could hear gagging, munching, and a scrunchy churning all around as the children devoured the fancy meal the elders had promised. Our feast was interrupted by a loud gong sounding in the distance. All of the men leapt to the ground, putting their faces down and holding the backs of their heads, like a bomb was going to go off. This is my chance, I thought, hoping that this was nothing but a lucky surprise. I glanced around, and shot for our building, keeping my steps quiet while moving at a jogging pace. Nobody followed me. The men were silent, the women brain dead, and the children began to murmur. I got inside and grabbed my go bag. My heart pumped so hard it felt like it was about to burst, and suddenly a violent gag emerged from my throat, followed by a stream of mother vomit that spewed all over the floors. It looked a bit like that cheap grocery store mac and cheese, which I'd had a couple times. Once I got back outside and began to head for the fence, I saw something in the distance, which stopped me in my tracks and begged for me to look. I should have run. I should not have looked. On the other side of the compound, behind the fence, something was emerging from the thick forest. It looked like an animal, except it was taller than any of the buildings we had, almost as tall as the trees. Gigantic, tendril-like arms protruded from its muscular body, and it almost looked like it was held up by hooved legs, sort of like a horse. An ear-shattering screech sounded, silencing all other sounds around me, and I knew that it was that thing. It launched towards the compound and jumped the fence, and I began to run in the opposite direction. I thought that it must have seen me, but looking behind me it had stopped near the stage. It walked slowly among the crowd of people, like it was trying to find something. I quickly reached the fence and found the exact spot where the wires were split, giving just enough room for me to wriggle myself out. I ran towards the tree line, and once I reached it, turned back to give one final look at the compound. In the distance, the creature stood between the children and the felled women. Its eyes were dark red, big as the moon, and I could feel it stare at me. I don't know how it could see me from such a distance, and maybe it didn't, but its gaze turned my legs into butter and a loud fear surged through my spine. It wanted me. I could feel it. And that's when I realized what it was. The One True God, Part 2. It didn't take long for the forest to close in on me, rattling my sense of direction. I tried my best to keep heading forward, but as I jumped over thick roots and ran around bushes the task became increasingly difficult. All I could do was keep moving, and pray that I was getting further away from the compound. I had overestimated how long I could run in such uneven terrain, and soon I was too exhausted to keep up a jogging pace. Blood ran like rapids around my ears, and I had to take ragged, uneven breaths before I could steady my breathing. Although I couldn't hear anyone chasing after me, I knew that stopping now would mean certain death. They always found runaways, and they always brought them back, and if I was to survive this, I had to keep going further and faster than anyone else before. In the dark, it was impossible to discern whether I was moving in circles, but I promised myself to keep going, no matter how slowly. No effort was in vain if it held even the slightest chance of getting me further away from that rotten place. Once my breathing returned back to its regular rhythm, I began to listen to the forest as I walked. The sounds of birds and small animals were familiar, and through their calls and movements I could discern an impressive amount of information about what was going on nearby. That's why my heart sank to my stomach when I heard birds begin to flee in the distance, spooked by something close by. As they flew above the treetops and toward safer grounds, I squinted my eyes and began to look for cover. Although I couldn't hear it yet, something was coming, and I needed to hide. Under a large tree, I could see a small crevice between its bulky roots, the earth eroded from between them. I made my way to it, and with some careful squeezing, fit myself snugly underneath. It wasn't perfect, If someone were to look directly at me, they could easily spot me between the roots. But any time spent searching was more time for someone to find me, so I laid myself as small as I could across the cold earth and hoped that the darkness would shelter me. For a while, it was quiet. A beetle scampered across my arm, but I didn't dare swat it away in case I'd be alerting anyone of my presence. My right ear was pressed to the ground, and slowly I began to hear low thumps coming through the ground. A vibration, really. And it was getting louder. I lifted up my head and shifted my attention to my surroundings. It wasn't footsteps I'd heard. That thing was coming for me, and I needed to be ready. The ground began to faintly shake as it approached, and soon I could hear it stepping on the ground, sticks and leaves succumbing under the pressure of its gargantuan body. My heart pounded fast and loud, and for whatever reason, I was afraid that it could hear it through my skin, the distinct human heart pumping blood in a steady rhythm. It was close now, moving somewhere behind me, stopping every once in a while to gauge its surroundings. I begged it to change course, for a mouse or a deer or some other poor soul to veer its attention away from me, but the forest kept quiet. It's like no living thing wanted to be near it, including me. The thing moved closer and closer, and for a faint moment I was convinced that it was sneaking up on me, and in the blink of an eye I would find myself wrapped in its fleshy tendrils, looking into its crimson eyes as it held me mid-air, ripping the limbs apart from my body, leaving nothing but an aching, defiant torso. Fear surged through me, but I had to do my best to tamp it down. Fear inhibited survival, and survival was priority number one. Its hoofs scraped rocks and cracked roots in two as it brought itself closer, until I could feel its heavy, toxic warm breath not far from me. Its movements were swift and careful for a being of its size. I could hear it take in the air, its body flexing as it looked for me with all its senses. I held my breath as much as I could, and kept the breaths in between brief. The lack of oxygen started to swerve my senses, the world became blurry and my arms and legs started to tingle, but I was too scared to breathe any louder or any faster. Just a little longer. Almost there. Its body scraped across the tree above me. I closed my eyes and decided that whatever happened, I wouldn't want to see it. This was it, the last call, the final push. The tree rustled again as it began to move, but now its steps became more distant. It was leaving. I hadn't been found. Once it was far enough that I could no longer distinguish its steps, I let out a sigh that nearly knocked me out, shooting stars reflecting along my vision. I laid there for a few minutes, concentrating on my breathing, regaining myself. Once my vision clarified and the world stopped spinning, I continued listening to the sounds of the forest. It was dead quiet. I pressed my ear against the ground, and confirmed that the thing was no longer nearby. I took a few more minutes to gather my courage. Staying hidden was less scary, but I knew that I couldn't stay there forever. I was just about ready to continue onwards when a faint sound began to crescendo from the forest. Its familiarity quickly pointed to it being a person's footsteps. But who? I immediately thought of my father, and the problem with that was that I couldn't outrun him. He'd gut me if he found me. From the distance, a voice called Allison. "It's Mom, I hear. Let me help you." It was my mother's voice, no doubt about it. But different. It stagnated on some syllables, like she was having trouble remembering how some words ended, elongating the previous syllable until she found the final piece. I stayed hidden, and waited to see where she was going, and tried to reason how she could still be alive. And where was Dad? Why was she alone? And was this a trap? "Allison. Mommy is here to help you," she yelled, walking some 50 yards away from me now, heading deeper into the forest. She turned silent again, and I had to strain my ears to pick up her footsteps. If she was here, the others couldn't be far off. And she was heading exactly where I needed to go. I tried to piece together a plan, but it quickly reduced into a game of only bad choices. Through the things and my mom's movements I regained some sense of direction, and I was somewhat confident on which way the compound was. Going anywhere except where my mom was heading could end up with me face to face with the creature. I could stay here for a while longer, but if the whole group came to search for me, especially in daylight, I'd be found in a matter of hours. Probably even sooner. The only choice was to go where Mom was. I could try talking to her. She might not want any harm to me. She wasn't like Dad. I stretched my legs for a moment, and slowly emerged from my hiding place, craning my neck to check every direction for movement. Mom was so deep into the forest by then that I could barely make out her footsteps, so I started slowly jogging towards her, ready to sprint if need be. Soon enough, I spotted her from the back. She walked robotically, lifting her knees extra high with each step, like she was overcompensating with each motion so as not to stumble on the uneven ground. She didn't seem to notice me, even though she was definitely in earshot. For a while, I followed her, hiding behind trees and bushes as she continued onwards. But she was just there. Alone, walking towards something. Void of any malice. A terrible sadness gripped me, and I remembered how she used to play with me when I was just a kid. She wasn't a good parent by any stretch, but she wasn't a bad person either. She didn't want anyone harm. She didn't deserve this. And of those few rare memories that still seemed good to me back then, she was a part of. I couldn't just leave her alone like this. "Mom?" I said. She kept walking. "Mom?" I repeated, louder this time. She stopped in her tracks, standing unnaturally straight. Slowly, she turned around to face me. The moonlight shone through the trees, illuminating her pale features like a statue. My gaze instantly locked onto her head, and the fresh, vivid memory of her brain stuck to my throat immediately brought forth a gag, which echoed through the woods. The skin around her split skull had begun to lazily drape across her head like a bucket hat. It was frayed and dirty, and thick clumps of coagulated blood mixed with dirt and grime drooped from it. Perhaps it was the moonlight, but her eyes looked completely blank, the pupils gone, replaced by nothing but milky whiteness. Fresh blood ran down her cheeks, dripping to her chest and sullying her dress. "Mom, Mai's here now," she said. "Hi, Mom," I said, thinking that if her mind hadn't been ruined, she would surely wish for death. "I'm going to go away. You should too. I know you don't want this. Mom has a fresh scent for you, darling." She didn't seem to understand what I was saying. She lifted up her right arm in an awkward arc, and began to search for her head with her hand. It took her a few tries until the hand hit the back of her head, and once it did, she grabbed it with all her fingers, making sure not to lose the catch. Her fingers skittered up her head, until they hit the bony crater within. Once there, she launched her index finger and thumb inside of her mind, wriggling them as her face took on a pensive note. After a good 10 seconds, her hand emerged, holding a tiny piece of her brain. She placed it on the palm of her other hand and reached it towards me. "This if fo are you, baby." I swallowed preemptively to fight against the bile making its way up my throat. "Mom, you need to stop that. I don't want that. Not for me, and not for you." Her face took on a clownish frown, and her palm closed up and squeezed into a tight fist. The piece of brain she held was wet and squishy enough to escape, coming out between her thumb and index finger with considerable force, sending it flying until it landed a few feet in front of her. She didn't seem to notice this, though. "Why don't you want me, darling?" she asked through vague, childish sobs. "Mom, I love you. But this is not what I want. I need to get out. Do you want to come with me? Because we need to hurry. They're coming." "Mommy is not enough and that's not how it was supposed to go," she said, her voice becoming increasingly muddled and frantic. Although she was now fully sobbing, I couldn't discern any tears coming from her eyes, like that part of her body no longer worked. She started becoming frantic. Her hands began to shake, and she looked like she was trying to think as hard as she could, the effort straining her face. She reminded me of some of the older people in the group, when their minds started to betray them and they no longer remembered the world which they inhabited and the people that they knew. "Mommy is bad, Mommy is bad, Mommy's bad," she began repeating, her inflection sharp and her volume increasingly loud. "Mom, you need to be quiet," I told her, trying to embody some form of authority in my voice. "Mommy's bad, Mommy's bad, Mommy's bad," she yelled, her voice cracking and loudly echoing through the forest, filling me with anger towards her. I cursed myself for trusting anyone from that cult, even my own mother. They were coming, and now they knew exactly where I was. I tried, didn't I? That's all I could do. I had to keep moving. I tried to run past her, but she suddenly jumped at me and grabbed my arm, bringing us both down on the ground. She twisted my arms and spread them wide as she sat on my legs. She wasn't a large woman by any means, but she could still easily tower over me. As much as I tried to flail myself free using the fury burning inside me, it was in vain, and I quickly stopped moving to conserve my strength and instead tried to think of a way out. She stared at me. Her face seemed to reset, going completely blank. I again tried to wriggle out of her grasp, but that seemed to trigger her, and she gripped me even tighter. She started to grind her teeth loudly, and thick, yellow spit dripped from the corner of her mouth. "You do need to eat. Do as your father says," she said, her gaze now somewhere beyond. Without warning, she relaxed all of the muscles in her neck, which dropped her head down, her teeth clicking together loudly as her jaw punched her chest. Her brain was now entirely visible to me, and she began to slowly push herself forward. I twisted my neck trying to face away from it, the effort futile. Cold, clumpy spit fell onto my neck. The pink worms of her mind grew closer and closer, until she suddenly turned limp, her arms and legs giving out in an instant. My face got the brunt of it, as my mouth and nose were inserted inside of her brain, which felt like a bowl of thick, cool noodles. Her serrated skull cut open my lip like a knife, and red-hot pain instantly flared up around my mouth, radiating into my jaw. Once I lifted her head away from mine, I could finally breathe. I was exhausted, and it was nearly impossible to push her limp body off of me, but somehow I did it. I spat out blood and mucus as I got up. My insides felt like nuclear waste, my wrists and legs were scratched and red, and moving around was difficult. As I got up, I looked over at Mom. Her face was dug into the earth, her dress dirty and muddy and torn. She was dead. It was my fault, I was sure of it. I made this happen. And how horrible must have those last moments have been for her. How her only child hated her so much, and she was confused and frustrated and angry and just wanting to do the thing that they told her to do. My sorrow was interrupted by movement coming from deep in the forest. To stay here would mean certain death, which was not an unappetizing option at that moment. Looking at Mom, I realized that if it would come to that, it would be on my own terms. I would not die at the hands of the group or that dreadful being that they worshipped, like she had. I wouldn't let them. I would be the god of my own death, and so I began to move. Progress was slow, and quickly it became obvious that I couldn't outrun them. I needed to find a hiding place, something secure enough that they couldn't immediately find me. In front of me spanned a monotone forest, flat and scarce for hiding spots, but the ground sloped downwards on my right, where the shadows were more abundant. I decided to follow the slant, and I soon found myself in a stone-walled ravine. They were close behind. I could hear them. And slowly, the ground began to shake, and I knew that the thing wasn't far behind either. I marched on, going as fast as I could. If tonight means death, it will not be of their hand. Soon, I noticed that the stone on my right held a spot darker than the rest of the wall, which was barely perceivable in the scant moonlight. A cave. When I walked up to it, from its depths wafted a dank, dense smell. I couldn't see how deep it went, or how well I could hide there, but I doubted that I'd be able to find a better spot. The opening was small enough that I had to bend down to get in, but once inside, I had more than enough room to stand up straight. I hoped that it would not become my tomb. I walked further down, keeping my hand on the wall for guidance. The cave sloped downwards for about 10 yards, until it opened up into a small clearing. I found its darkest corner and sat down on the cold, hard rock. From there, I could still see the opening of the cave, but it was unlikely that anyone looking in from the outside could spot me. I held my knees, steadied my breath, and began to wait. It wasn't long until I could hear scattered footsteps above and around me. They were close. I was scared, sure, but the exhaustion had begun to overpower my fear. If it weren't for the constant surges of adrenaline and the overextended fight or flight reaction, I'm sure I would have passed out. My body begged for release. But I had to be awake, even though if they found me, there's not much that I could do. On my own terms, I thought as I stared at the dim light seeping in from the opening of the cave. Not on theirs. I was entranced by the light, staring at it for movement, until suddenly I realized I was shaking from the cold. I squeezed myself tighter, trying to dampen any and all sound that might come out of me. Everything echoed in the cave, and that meant that I needed to be extra careful. They were all around me now, yet I didn't hear any voices. I heard them walking around the forest, searching, yet none of them said a word, and I could no longer hear the thing's pounding steps either. Something was off. Someone suddenly jumped into the ravine. I could hear him, moving between the stone walls, inching closer to me. I held my breath as he walked past the cave's opening. It was one of the other kids. Jacob, I think. We'd hung out a few times, which was about the amount of times I'd hung out with anyone else in the group, since we'd all grown up together. But he didn't look like him. His eyes were gleaming red, and he moved sporadically, like a puppet. I'm sure if it was really Jacob, he would have noticed the hole in the wall. That's the type of stuff kids see, you know, cool sticks, puddles, hiding places, and holes. But he moved right past it, not giving it a second look. This bothered me, but I was grateful that I hadn't been found, at least not yet. The search party began to dissipate, moving further into the forest. I was safe, for now, but I was still stuck. I needed to find a way out, but it would have been suicide to try and walk among 100 children and that creature still in the forest. I had to wait for dawn. Once I'd decided to stay in the cave, my body released all that aching tension, and I immediately grew tired and sore, yet comfortably numb. I passed out in what felt like an instant. The sunlight gleamed through the crack of the cave, illuminating slowly moving waves of dust in the air like poppy seeds blown off their skeletal stems. My throat ached for water, and as I began to move, my body pleaded for more rest. Each blink of the eye wanted to stay shut. It took me a painful minute to come to my senses. The sleep deprivation made relevant thoughts hard to come by, and fresh, blood-soaked memories were a stew of on and off delirium. A terrible nightmare. A lived-in terror. The burden of being alive was thrust upon me with force, but I did not feel awake, much less alive. I moved my arm across the peaking sunlight, and its warmth was an antidote for the wish of death that had begun to ferment in the back of my mind. A single conviction lifted me to stand on my shaking legs. Keep moving. I listened to the forest until I was satisfied that the others were gone. Once outside, I had to readjust my eyes to the light, bringing tears to my scorching eyes. Birds chirped with glee, and bushes rustled with the sounds of small critters rummaging about their daily tasks. Once I was out of the ravine, the forest looked completely different in the sunlight, making it increasingly difficult to determine which way was forward. Colors and defined shapes splattered across the way. Leaves fluttered and danced in the wind as damp moss squished under my feet. Ferns like bodyguards littered the forest floor. It felt as if a curse had been lifted, and the forest had been relinquished back to its old self. I used the ravine as my focal point to figure out which way I had come from, and then headed into the opposite direction. I walked with my eyes crossed and blurry from exhaustion, keeping my ears perked for anything that differed from the chatter of the woods. Soon, I began to hear voices in the distance. I approached carefully, and came to the edge of a small clearing. I hid behind a large boulder, carefully peeking over and around it to see what was happening. In the clearing, standing in a scattered circle was my father alongside some other men from the group. Between them, I could see men holding shovels rising from the ground between them. They were digging a hole. Behind them I could see men coming through the woods with wheelbarrows, dumping something next to the pit, then returning to the forest. The wind picked up and faced me, confirming my suspicions. Death was in the air. I wondered if they'd found Mother already. The men spoke angrily between spiteful shoveling, arguing amongst each other. My father looked like he was ready to explode. smash something, or someone, to pieces. Venomous, dry spit filled my mouth as I watched him scream and argue with the other men. I wished death upon all of them. I wanted to run up there with a knife and slice through their throats and their most precious veins until the earth was thick with their blood. But I'd go to my father first. Even if the rest could fend me off, kill me before I could get them, I wanted to make sure that he would die. It was his fate, I concluded. For the first time I really saw him for what he was, a dead man walking. I wondered if the anger I felt was a curse I'd inherited from him. But I had to contain myself, and I swallowed the vile spit and continued past them while keeping my eyes set on their movements. I moved slowly, being careful around wavering bushes and sticks that could crack and give away my position. The sun beat down through the trees at the edge of the clearing, burning my skin. Almost out of reach, I stepped on a mossy rock and slipped, tumbling over long grass. Oh no! The men quieted for a moment, and I knew that they heard me. Over there! One of them shouted. I lifted myself up and started running as fast as I could. Toxic puffs of breath inebriated my mind and squeezed my lungs as my legs worked overtime to escape. I didn't look back, but I could hear rustling behind me. Getting closer. I jumped over rocks and thick roots, hoping that they'd get caught up in the terrain. Shouting, now! My worst fear incarnated as a large, rugged hand that grabbed the nape of my neck, pulling my torso down to the ground as my legs flailed towards the sky. They had me. Tears laced with fear started pouring out of the corners of my eyes as the man stood over me, scanning my face. The man bent down and placed his knee on my chest, squeezing all the air out of my lungs in one swift move. My ribs were on the verge of crumbling under his weight. He turned his head around and gestured towards someone. It's her. Behind him, someone replied, bring her to the pit. Another man came to his aid, and they dragged me by my arms to the clearing. I wasn't about to help them, so I kept my body limp, my feet dragging the ground as they puffed and huffed their way to the pit. They threw me down next to the hole, and I could feel the cool earth below beckoning me. Then, that dreadful, vile voice scraped my ears. Allison! You effing scum! My father yelled, walking up to face me. You ruined it all, don't you get it? You're a disgrace to yourself. To us. I didn't answer. I imagined a knife manifesting into the palm of my hand, but it wouldn't come. Don't you have anything to say for yourself? I kept silent, which just seemed to amp him up. I could feel his fuse burning short. You whore. Just like your mother, a degenerate cunt with no mind to speak of. You think your little play was smart? You're effing dead, I'll make sure of it. On the other side of the pit, a sweaty man dumped another body on the mountain. Their limbs were like snakes in heat, twisting and turning over and under each other as heads popped out in between, oozing out brains flocked by hundreds of flies, the sun fermenting their insides. That's the last one, the man said carefully, noticing the tense scene before him. I stared into his eyes, begging for mercy. Well, darling, you're gonna get what's coming. You could have joined them, but now it's all gone to hell, father said, moving behind me now, his shadow lingering over me. My head whiplashed as his boot made contact with my back with terrifying force, sending me flying into the death pit. In the cool shadow of my grave I tasted the iron of the earth and tried to move, but my back was sore and frigid. When I finally turned around, I saw the dark features of my father's head blocking the sun in an evil eclipse. He spat on my face with anger, blinding my left eye. Let's begin, he said to the other men, giving me one last look before walking away. The men got to work, and began to drop the bodies of the women into the pit. Their stiff cadavers rolled over the edges, kicking up dirt and dust, making it difficult for me to breathe. Dodging them was difficult, and soon my legs were trapped between two bodies, and I could no longer move. The bodies kept coming, rolling down like logs on a hill, until I was neck deep in them, gasping for air. Their smell was putrid and their limbs cold, giving me violent shivers as the earth engulfed us. The women hugged me in their death-cold embrace, as their minds were oozing out bit by bit, sticking to my skin like glue. Flies swarmed feverishly around me, delighted by the feast. The air quickly became toxic, the fumes coating my lungs with scorching rot. Through the menagerie of body parts, oozing liquids and dry coatings beginning to form on their open skulls, the only thing I felt was fury. Pure, unafraid fury that coursed through my veins, wanting only one thing, to kill my father, and everyone else who'd been part of this unholy massacre. And I couldn't do it. They had won. As the sun was blotted out by yet another dead vessel, I heard a commanding shout from a distance. The men stopped working, and for a split second, the forest was silent. Then it began raining fire. The air erupted in a sea of bullets, weapons violently clicking as they dispersed their deadly ammunition. I could hear quick thumps slicing through flesh in hot streaks that were followed by bodies falling on the ground. I couldn't see who was shooting and who was being shot at, but in a span of 30 seconds the firefight ended. My ears rang with their seething echo, but my senses told me to keep shut. Not until I knew what had happened. Steps, confident and assertive, came closer until they surrounded the pit and fired off singular rounds, making sure that their targets were eliminated. There was something surgical about it, just a quick procedure done according to protocol. Muffled voices started coming through, and with nothing left to lose, I cried for help. After some discussion amongst the gunmen, bodies began being lifted out of the pit, and rays of sunlight stabbed my eyes. Once they'd removed enough bodies to see me, I was faced with a small army of men pointing big, black assault rifles at my head. Someone said one of them's alive. A man without a gun emerged from between them. He nodded at me and said, "That's her." The men worked efficiently to clear up the human debris, and with a gentle touch they lifted me out of the pit. Finally free of the mess of bodies, I could smell that I had inherited their odor. It stuck to me, and I thought that I would forever be stained by the sickly sweet scent of death. The man without a gun walked up to me and looked me up and down silently. The others stayed quiet, posing with their guns gripped, ready to aim them in seconds if need be. "Allison," he said. I looked up at his face, holding my hand as a visor to shield me from the sun. "Isn't that your name?" I hadn't spoken in so long, that when I tried to, all that came out was a dry cough. On my second try I mustered out a croaked, dehydrated yes. The man turned and signaled at the armed men. They brought down their guns, and one of them brought me a water bottle. I drank it in one go, wheezing for air through my nose between gulps as the plastic bottle crumpled from suction. "We heard what happened here, Allison. You're safe with us. We're going to take you away." A flower bloomed in my mind. The plan had worked, I was finally saved. The relief washed over me so harshly I almost fell to the ground as my body let out all its aches into the arms of this gentle savior. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," I sobbed as tears of joy welled up in my eyes. "Come with me. We'll take care of you," the man said, holding out his hand. As he escorted me to the edge of the clearing, I glanced over my shoulder at the scene. All of the men were shot dead, including my father. It was like an angel had descended to do the deed for which I was too drained to do. It was finally over. I was out, and my father was dead, like he should be. As we walked through the woods, I suddenly remembered Jacob and the rest. "What about the others?" "The others?" the man asked. "The other kids. There's more of them, like me. We'll take care of them. Don't worry. And, I'm sorry about your mother. She died for no reason. A terrible thing." "Thank you," I whispered, squeezing his hand tight as he continued leading me through the woods. The forest came to an abrupt end. We were at another clearing, and there was a line of obsidian-colored cars lined up neatly. Beyond them, a dirt road curved around a placid field. I was escorted to one of the cars, and the man buckled me into the back seat before he jumped to the driver's seat. We waited for a while, until one of the armed men emerged from the forest and joined us, clambering his way into the front passenger seat. The car began to back out, and in a flash, we were flying through the road, the car bumping over potholes in a soothing rhythm, rough dirt crackling under its heavy tires. I was enamored by the sights. I'd never seen fields like this before. Everything was fresh, and even though it was just boring countryside, to me it was heaven. Once we met an intersection and moved on to a paved road that took away all those soothing irregularities of the dirt, the two men began to talk to each other. "What do we do with her?" asked the armed man, his gun now tucked tightly between his legs, the muzzle resting against the floor. "It's the men's fault. They didn't take enough precautions. But she's the outlier. That's not her fault." "I know, but what? She isn't responsible. That angry drunk, her father, is. He should have kept a closer eye on her. He's the reason for all this." I didn't quite understand what they were discussing, but I trusted them. They helped me. Saved me from sudden death. And the unarmed man seemed to share my hate for my father, and that was enough kinship for me. "Either way," the armed man continued, more careful with his choice of words now, "we found the men destroying the evidence, the women dead, and 100 kids working for nothing. It's a hell of a lot to clean up, is all I'm saying. And what purpose does she have, anymore?" "She? Purpose?" I started getting queasy in my seat, but I refrained from interrupting their conversation, instead looking out the window with a slack-jawed face, like I was too fixated on the outside world to hear them talking. "She could still serve a purpose." "How?" "She doesn't even know," and then the armed man glanced at me and continued in a whisper, "She doesn't even know what it is. She escaped and evaded capture for a full day. Almost got out. She's smart. And with the state of what happened there, we need more thinkers among us. Besides, she's well acquainted now." The car swerved into a side road that meandered through another forest. I started getting nauseous from the movements of the vehicle as we went up hills and around bends, until finally we came to a straight patch of road, which led to a large clearing. The men got out of the car and the unarmed man came to open the door for me, gently lifting me out of the backseat. "It's just a little walk away. Can you do that?" he asked me with soft eyes. I nodded, and we descended down a dirt road that led us through the forest. I started getting scared again, but after all that had happened, I would rather be anywhere than back near that compound. Besides, I had no clear idea of how the outside world worked, so I put my faith in the unarmed man, trusting him to bring me somewhere safe. The forest started clearing up, and we ascended a faint hill. Once we reached the top, before us laid a large valley surrounded by the forest. Down there were buildings, small farms, and people that looked like ants from this far high. The whole concoction was surrounded by a high metal fence. It looked exactly like the compound I had just escaped.